In 2024, Birdcage opened in Atlantic City, becoming the first gay bar to open in the city in 20 years. Over the last few decades, short-lived queer bars and events would periodically occur in the city, but Atlantic City has struggled to attract LGBTQ plus tourists when compared to other Northeast gay resorts like P-Town, Fire Island, Asbury Park, and Rehoboth Beach. However, if we turn back the clock 50, 60, or even 80 years, we would see a very different story. In 1969, Atlantic City alone had 8 gay bars. Today there are only 6 in the entire state of New Jersey. So what happened? I'll go further in depth on Atlantic City in a future video, but needless to say, it was largely the result of the same factors that devastated Jersey's urban areas in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, meaning car culture, the decline of the railroads, suburbanization, disinvestment in cities, white flight, violent crime, and broken windows policing all played a role. There was also another factor that directly impacted the queer community of New Jersey, the Lavender Scare. While today New Jersey is one of the most progressive states on LGBTQ+ issues, it's important to remember that A, culture isn't static, and B, Jersey is extremely Catholic. Homosexuality, or as Republican candidate for governor Jack Ciattarelli likes to call it, sodomy, was first criminalized in these fair lands by the Dutch. These laws were enforced to different extremes over the centuries, but for the most part, the homosexual underground largely flew under the radar until the 1920s and 30s. It's around this time that Atlantic City became the world's playground. After Prohibition ended, New Jersey created the Board of Alcohol Beverage Control to issue licenses and discipline bars that breach regulations, including those on quote-unquote female impersonators. So what counted as a female impersonator in the 1930s? To the 20th century man, a female impersonator was a cross-dresser, drag performer, trans woman, trans man, effeminate man, gay or bisexual man, or a butch lesbian. Pretty much any and every queer person could be labeled as a female impersonator and have their life scrutinized by the state and ostracized by the public. In 1967, queer people in New Jersey gained the right to assemble when regulations regarding female impersonators and law-abiding homosexuals were overturned, when the Atlantic City gay bar, Val's, challenged the suspension of their liquor license. In 1978, the state finally repealed its sodomy laws, with much of its strong legal protections being codified in the new millennium. In 2010, then State Attorney General Gurbir Grewal formally apologized for the ABC's homophobic policies and the raids on gay bars in the 20th century. And the ABC's records on these raids were released to the public by the state library that same year. So let's go through these records and consider them a hostile witness to a culture that was largely erased from the state's history. Between 1935 and 1972, they counted 150 instances of bars being punished for hiring female impersonators, serving homosexuals, or even permitting any queer person on their premises. And since this is a channel nominally about the Pine Barrens, let's focus on the reports here. In February of 1957, the Cloverleaf Inn of Mays Landing had its liquor license suspended for multiple instances of permitting female impersonators on its premises in the June of the previous year. Again, it's important to remember that female impersonator could have meant basically any queer person, and in this particular case, it referred specifically to butch lesbians, trans masks, and gay men. In this report, cops noted multiple women dressed like men, particularly noting two, the masked Freddie and her femme girlfriend Renee, who were seen kissing. On subsequent visits, they reported more lesbian couples as well as a few gay men, with the bartender defending himself to the police, saying, "I can't distinguish between a gay and a straight. How am I supposed to know?" Much like former children's author and current Holocaust denier Robert Galbraith, these investigators claim that they could always recognize a female impersonator. As we see with item 2 from the very same bulletin, in April of 1956, the Paddock Bar in Asbury Park, quote-unquote, permitted and suffered female impersonators and apparent homosexuals, who, among other things, spoke in higher than normal tones, held cigarettes in the tips of their fingers, swayed their hips when they walked, and giggled in a feminine manner. On other nights, cops noted that the men called each other terms like honey, darling, or dear. Although the cops reported nothing lewd or inappropriate occurring, the ABC still suspended the bar's license for 60 days for serving homosexuals. That is not to say that nothing lewd ever occurred at these bars, but since this is on YouTube, I'll only assume that only pure things were occurring at the Ramrod in Atlantic City. Over the last few years, in our current moral panic around trans people, the Republican government of these United States has tried framing all discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity as inherently pornographic, and as such, deny gay and trans people the basic dignity of using restrooms, seeking healthcare, reporting harassment, or simply existing in public spaces. And, since there is nothing new under the sun, in the disciplinary bulletin for the Speedway Inn of Waterford Township, Director William Howe Davis writes that, although nothing lewd or inappropriate occurred at that bar, the object manifestly inherent in the rule is primarily to discourage and prevent not only lewdness, but also to suppress the inception of any immoral activity. Which is to say that by being a queer person in a queer space, you cannot be trusted to behave appropriately. Since these regulations deny queer people the ability to exist and meet in public spaces, how did they meet up to begin with? And what was life like in the homosexual underground of the 50s and 60s? Before Grindr and Scruff, before chat rooms and GeoCities, people signified that they were queer using symbols and codes. While many people today may be familiar with the hanky code, or may even have heard of Polari, in the glory days of Atlantic City, gay men would wear brightly colored silk garters with their bathing suits, and trick pants, pale purple hose, tan shoes with 2-inch soles, and lavender neckties when walking the boardwalk. When Louisa Mack opened the city's first gay bar, the Entertainers Club, she enforced a strict dress code to allay any suspicion of her clientele. The existence of these clubs was often spread through word of mouth, and much like the dress code at the Entertainers Club, the more established ones had codes of conduct that helped them avoid police crackdowns until the Lavender Scare really ratcheted up. At the Snug Harbor Inn of Mullica Township, newcomers might be greeted with suspicion upon arrival, initially being limited to their small bar room. A straight person might get as far as the bar, get insulted by the bartender, and then leave. But in time, a gay guy might be invited to the back room, which had a bar, tables, and a jukebox. They might find some guys dancing, and maybe kissing as the night goes on. So how did they stay in business when so many others failed? Well, they kept things on the down low. They limited their entrance and set up a buzzer so they could be selective about who they let in. They created memberships for people they trusted and could easily warn patrons if cops arrived. They were very smart about protecting their business and their patrons, except, well, I've been getting all this information from a police report. On January 5th, 1957, police raided the Snug Harbor Inn, and in the process they collected the boxes containing the personal information of 361 men and 80 women who had been members. Quick question. Who owns Grindr? Grindr is the world's largest gay hookup and dating app, and in 2016, the app's Chinese owners were basically forced to sell to American venture capitalists over concerns that the Obama administration had over national security. Even if it's not a shady situation like OpenAI, where the US intelligence community are actively on its board, for decades now, the US government has maintained that LGBTQ plus individuals are easier to manipulate and easier to blackmail than the general public. And it's hard not to see this as a way of just spying on the queer community in general. It's important to note that the Lavender Scare didn't destroy the queer community of New Jersey. Yes, there are fewer queer establishments today than there were decades ago, but when you look at the timeline, you can see that we weathered it. VALS won queer people the right to assemble in New Jersey a year before Stonewall. The sad truth is that the biggest factor to the decline of queer spaces in New Jersey was the suburbanization and hollowing out of cities like Camden, Newark, and Atlantic City, allowing New York and Philly to become the core of New Jersey's queer community. Although things may look bleak in our current political climate, and voting blue no matter who clearly isn't going to save us, we've been through this before, and their playbook hasn't changed in the last 100 years. And the story isn't over. In the new millennium, Asbury Park managed to reverse its decline, with much of its revitalization being credited to the queer community who stuck around and returned. Likewise, towns like Plainfield and Collingswood have become gay villages in their own right. And the opening of Birdcage shows that Atlantic City is moving in the right direction.